Okay, so imagine, your favorite coffee place, and
Yeah.
suddenly, overnight, they completely change the beans, the vibe, everything. It's jarring.
Right.
That's kind of a tiny, tiny taste of what apparently happened in global politics back in early 2025.
Hmm.
We're going to dive into this really intense few weeks, specifically February, right after President Trump's second term kicked off. And it was like someone just flipped a switch on the whole U.S.-Europe relationship.
It really was. We're looking at this incredibly fast sequence of events, almost like dominoes just falling one after another.
Yeah.
And it really forced Europe to fundamentally rethink its alliance with the U.S., an alliance that had stood for decades.
Exactly. And not just one thing, as you say, but a whole cascade of policy shifts, diplomatic surprises.
Yeah, a real cascade.
So, for everyone listening, what we want to do today is try and unpack just how quickly and, frankly, how significantly things change. We're talking major shifts in defense policy, really surprising moves on big global issues, and this diplomatic scramble that felt, well, unprecedented.
It truly did. And, while European leaders probably braced themselves for, let's say, challenges with a second Trump term.
Sure, they knew it wouldn't be smooth sailing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the sheer magnitude and the speed of the changes, especially around long-standing defense policies, it seems like that really caught them off guard. It was like expecting maybe a bit of rain and getting a full-on flash flood.
That's a good analogy. It wasn't just the policies themselves, was it? It was this feeling that the actual foundation, the bedrock of the relationship, was shaking.
Precisely. And this huge question emerged almost immediately. Is the U.S., traditionally Europe's strongest partner, actually becoming a source of instability, for even a threat?
Which is just a massive question to even contemplate about your closest ally. Really jarring.
It is. And the reports we've seen paint this picture of constant policy whiplash, zigzagging on issues from Gaza, Greenland, Ukraine, trade.
Yeah.
It was a real roller coaster.
Like trying to follow a plot that keeps twisting every 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine trying to plan, I don't know, a major project when the rules and objectives change daily. That was the kind of uncertainty European leaders were grappling with, but on a global scale.
And it sounds like even just figuring out what was the official U.S. policy became a challenge in itself, with announcements possibly popping up on social media, maybe getting reversed.
Right, a lot of confusion. It created this constant, wait, what just happened feeling.
Yeah.
But through all that noise, the core message coming out of Washington seemed pretty consistent, actually, and quite stark.
Which was?
Basically, Europe, you need to step up. You need to handle your own security. That long-standing American military umbrella, don't take it for granted anymore.
Like being told the safety net might just disappear. A fundamental shift in expectations.
Absolutely. And what seemed particularly worrying for many in Europe, according to these accounts, was how some of President Trump's rhetoric started to, well, echo narratives coming straight from the Kremlin.
You mean like the example given, the inaccurate claim about Ukraine starting the war?
Exactly that. When your main ally starts repeating talking points used by your primary adversary, that obviously sets off major alarm bells across European capitals.
It's deeply unsettling. It makes you question if you're even working from the same reality anymore.
It erodes trust at a fundamental level. Are we still on the same team here? That kind of question.
So the first big flashpoint, it seems, was this NATO defense ministers meeting in Brussels. Mid-February,
Yeah.
U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth arrived, and apparently he brought some pretty blunt news.
He certainly did. Hegseth essentially laid it out for the European allies. Zelensky needed to give up on reclaiming all lost territory, including the parts lost before 2014. Just not realistic was the message.
Wow.
And crucially, he made it very clear, Ukraine joining NATO wasn't on the cards. Not anytime soon. That was a major departure from the established line.
A huge departure. And then you have this almost bizarre timing with the UK Defense Secretary John Healey. He's right there, presumably trying to digest this, when news suddenly breaks about a phone call between Trump and Putin. And apparently, it was Healey's birthday.
Yeah, the reports mention that specifically. Talk about awkward timing. The geopolitical ground shifts under your feet, and it happens to be your birthday. Definitely not the celebration he envisioned, I imagine.
You couldn't script it better or worse, depending on your view.
And then came Trump's post on Truth Social, confirming the call, saying they'd agreed to work closely, teams would start immediate negotiations, and that they'd inform Zelensky.
Inform him, not consult, not involve. Inform.
Exactly. A very direct, maybe even dismissive signal of a major policy shift being decided over his head.
It's interesting, though, that privately, Hegseth apparently tried to smooth things over a bit, saying something like, "We know who the goodies are. We know who the baddies are."
Yes, that quote surfaced. It sounds, well,
Yeah.
incredibly simplistic, doesn't it, for such a complex situation?
Like trying to explain geopolitics with cartoon characters.
Pretty much. While maybe intended as reassurance, that kind of black and white thinking probably did little to ease the deep anxieties about the actual strategic implications of this new U.S. approach. People wanted nuance, not just labels.
And despite all this, there was still talk floating around about security guarantees for Ukraine, right? If not NATO, then something else.
Yes, that became the focus. The natural assumption in Europe was, okay, if NATO membership is off the table, then surely the U.S. will be central to providing strong security guarantees.
Which makes sense.
You had EU figures like Kaja Kallas urging caution, saying don't rule anything out prematurely. They were clearly hoping to salvage some kind of strong commitment. Okay, plan A is gone. What about plan B?
But Hegseth seemed to slam the door shut on NATO membership quite firmly.
He did. And that message, unsurprisingly, was reportedly received very positively in the Kremlin.
And the immediate result on the ground.
Almost immediately, Russia intensified its attacks on Ukraine. Drones, shelling, aerial strikes. A significant uptick.
It's hard not to connect those dots. It looks like a signal of perceived weakness being exploited.
It certainly raised concerns that the shift in the U.S. stance might have inadvertently emboldened Moscow, or at least weakened Kyiv's position. A clear example of how quickly diplomatic words can have real-world kinetic consequences.
Then, just days later, you have the Munich Security Conference. Always a place for debate, sometimes heated, but this year sounds like it was different.
Very different by all accounts. The atmosphere was particularly tense, and a big part of that was the international debut of U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance.
Right, bringing his America First stance onto the global stage.
He certainly didn't hold back. There was this observation from French Senator Claude Malhuret, basically saying that Europeans in the room suddenly grasped that their survival, Ukraine's survival, Europe's survival, was now firmly in their own hands.
A real moment of realization. Or maybe isolation.
Perhaps both. The feeling of the safety net being pulled away.
And Vance didn't stop at Ukraine, did he? He apparently took aim at European governments themselves.
He did. Criticizing them on a whole range of internal issues, ignoring the will of their people, religious freedoms, failing to stop illegal migration. It felt like a very direct, almost unprecedented intervention in the domestic affairs of allies.
Like your neighbor lecturing you on how to raise your kids? Very unusual on that kind of stage.
Highly unusual. He went far beyond standard foreign policy critique. And then came that really striking line.
The one about the biggest threat?
Yeah. Vance saying the threat he worried most about for Europe wasn't Russia, wasn't China, wasn't external at all. He said, what I worry about is the threat from within.
Wow. That's quite a statement to make to a room full of European leaders, suggesting the problem isn't Moscow, it's them.
Essentially, yes. Accusing them of being out of touch, implying their internal policies were the real danger, a profoundly different message than allies usually exchange.
And the reaction, it sounds like it wasn't just polite disagreement.
Not at all. We saw that quote from a former House Democratic staffer, pretty blunt language, what the fuck was that? Capturing the sheer shock and disbelief.
Right. I had my mouth open in a room full of people with their mouth open. That was bad.
Exactly. And a German official apparently called it insane and worrying. These weren't mild reactions. It showed just how far Vance's remarks had strayed from diplomatic norms. It felt like a challenge to the whole basis of the alliance.
And this seems to have triggered a pretty immediate, almost frantic response from Europe.
It did. Almost immediately after Munich, you had Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski making this surprise announcement about an emergency meeting in Paris.
Surprise being the operative word.
Apparently so. The French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, reportedly looked quite nervous, indicating the plans weren't exactly finalized or meant to be public yet. It felt a bit like someone hitting the panic button.
Understandable, perhaps, given the context.
It really highlighted the sense of urgency. European leaders felt they had to do something fast, even if it meant scrambling and maybe stepping on some diplomatic toes.
So this led to crisis talks in Paris on February 17th, followed by more diplomacy. Macron and the UK's new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, seemed to emerge as key players, right? Planning trips to D.C.
Yes, they really stepped into the void, trying to coordinate a European response and engage directly with the Trump administration.
Though it's interesting that initial Paris meeting apparently didn't include the Eastern European states, the ones right on the border with Russia, focused more on the bigger Western European players.
That was noted. While maybe done for speed or specific focus, excluding nations like the Baltics, who arguably had the most at stake, immediate stake, probably didn't sit well everywhere. It seems slightly counter to the usual EU emphasis on total unity.
And Starmer, even before the Paris meeting, made this quite striking comment about potentially putting British troops in Ukraine, but as part of enforcing a peace deal,
Yeah.
building on earlier ideas of peacekeepers.
Yes, that was a significant statement, signaling a new level of potential UK involvement, a willingness for Europe to perhaps take on roles previously unthinkable without direct U.S. leadership.
And amid all this frantic diplomacy, you had Latvian President Edgars Rinkovic offering some rather stark advice. Never stop panicking.
Right. That really captured the mood, didn't it? The constant hum of anxiety had become a roar.
Meanwhile, back in the U.S., President Trump wasn't exactly helping calm nerves, attacking Zelensky again from Mar-a-Lago.
Yes, criticizing him for complaining about being excluded from the U.S.-Russia talks. Trump reportedly said something like, "You should have never started it. You could have made a deal."
Which ignores the reality of the invasion, of course.
Completely. And then adding more insults, calling Zelensky incompetent, a dictator without elections. Again, language mirroring Kremlin propaganda.
It's like pouring gasoline on the fire of European anxieties.
It certainly made presenting any kind of united front incredibly difficult.
Yet, despite this backdrop, both Macron and Starmer were determined to engage with Trump. Macron even managed to jump the queue, as it was put, to be the first European leader to visit the new White House.
There definitely seemed to be a subtle, maybe not so subtle race between Paris and London to get that first crucial meeting, to try and build some kind of rapport or influence.
Macron stayed at Blair House, trying to rekindle that idea of a special relationship. But even then, there was tension, wasn't there?
Reportedly so. There was this moment during their discussions where Macron apparently had to interrupt Trump to correct him on a point about European aid to Ukraine, specifically that it wasn't all loans.
A small detail, perhaps, but telling, shows the need to constantly manage information even in those high-level meetings. Awkward, but necessary, as you said.
Exactly. It highlights the potential for fundamental misunderstandings. And behind the scenes, Macron was apparently also lobbying Trump to invite Zelensky to Washington, too.
Setting the stage for later drama. Meanwhile, Europe was trying to send its own signals.
Yes, you had top EU officials making a very public visit to Kyiv, a clear demonstration of solidarity with Zelensky in Ukraine, precisely when they might have felt most isolated by Washington.
But that solidarity didn't seem to extend to EU lawmakers visiting D.C. Their experience sounded pretty negative.
Quite the opposite, it seems. Reports suggested meetings were abruptly canceled, citing some kind of new policy against meeting politicians specifically labeled as EU.
That sounds incredibly pointed, almost hostile, like being uninvited at the door.
It was certainly interpreted as a snub,
Yeah.
a worrying sign of a potential move away from engaging with the EU as a bloc.
And then, adding insult to injury, came reports of the U.S. siding with Moscow on a UN vote condemning the invasion.
That was a particularly shocking development for many European allies. Aligning with Russia against a condemnation of the invasion felt like a fundamental betrayal of shared values.
Like your teammate suddenly scoring for the other side. Just baffling and deeply concerning.
It suggested a potential geopolitical realignment that few in Europe were prepared for.
Back in London, Starmer then pulls out this surprise move. A big hike in UK defense spending.
A very significant announcement.
Right.
But the controversial part was how it was funded by slashing the international aid budget.
And this was seen as an attempt to impress Trump, right? To show the UK was pulling its weight before Starmer's own trip to Washington.
That was certainly the interpretation. Aligning with Trump's demands for increased European defense spending, demonstrating burden sharing. Defense Secretary Healey reportedly got positive feedback from Hegseth on it.
But it caused problems at home.
Big problems.
Yeah.
Apparently, the plan wasn't widely circulated within the government. The minister responsible for humanitarian aid resigned in protest, completely blindsided. A grand gesture aimed at Washington that backfired domestically.
So Starmer heads to Washington. On the plane, he's sounding quite cautious, emphasizing how crucial the meeting with Trump is.
Understandably so. The stakes were incredibly high. He was walking a very delicate tightrope.
And his key ask was going to be about security for potential European peacekeepers in Ukraine.
Yes, specifically asking for a U.S. backstop, things like aerial intelligence, maybe air cover. A practical request aimed at ensuring the safety of European troops if they were deployed in a risky environment without direct U.S. ground involvement.
A significant request. But then,
Then, almost unbelievably, just about an hour after Starmer briefed the press on the plane about this planned request,
Trump pulls the rug out.
completely, Trump publicly stated he wasn't going to make major new security guarantees beyond what was already committed. We're going to have Europe do that, was the reported quote.
Wow, so Starmer's main request was publicly shot down before he even landed.
Essentially, yes. Imagine being part of Starmer's delegation on that flight, hearing that news break. Utterly deflating. It left him in a massively weakened position before the meeting even began.
Meanwhile, Macron was meeting Germany's new leader, Friedrich Merz. And Merz had just come out with this really historic statement for Germany.
Yes, post-election, Merz vowed Germany would seek greater independence from Trump's America.
Yeah.
A really profound shift away from Germany's traditionally very strong pro-Atlanticist stance.
It signals this growing mood in Europe, doesn't it? This realization that things have fundamentally changed and they need more strategic autonomy.
Absolutely. Merz's statement was perhaps the clearest signal yet of that shift happening at the very top of a major European power.
So Starmer finally gets to the Oval Office. He's trying hard to build some rapport, right? Touching Trump's arm, presenting a letter from King Charles.
Pulling out all the stops, it seems, trying to find some common ground, establish a personal connection under immense pressure.
And Trump's reaction, there was that comment about British peacekeepers needing to take care of themselves. Superficially positive, maybe, but
But with a definite edge, yeah. Like, good luck, you're on your own. A veiled warning, perhaps, reinforcing the message that direct U.S. support might not be forthcoming if things went wrong.
there were, however, a couple of seemingly positive signs around that time. Talk of a U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal, and Zelensky's planned visit to D.C. was confirmed.
Yes, for a brief moment there was a glimmer of hope. The minerals deal seemed like a tangible area of cooperation, and Zelensky finally getting the invitation suggested maybe things could be put back on a more constructive track.
There was even talk in Kyiv about the sequence being, right, minerals deal first, then security guarantees, then meetings with European leaders. Some optimism, perhaps misplaced.
A sense that maybe a diplomatic pathway was emerging, however fragile.
But then came the Zelensky visit itself, and specifically this infamous fiery exchange, as reports called it, between Zelensky and Trump, with Vance also involved, apparently over those security guarantees.
Yes, that seems to be where everything truly imploded. Details are obviously filtered, but the accounts suggest a major confrontation in the Oval Office.
And the reactions from European diplomats who heard about it were visceral.
Extremely strong. Quotes like, "It made me want to throw up," and "fuck me, this is really bad."
Yeah.
That kind of raw emotional reaction tells you just how serious the breakdown was perceived to be.
It sounds like the moment their worst fears about the relationship were confirmed.
Exactly. A fundamental clash, apparently, laying bare the disagreements and the raw feelings involved.
And the fallout was immediate.
Instantaneous. Macron, reportedly on his plane, immediately called Zelensky. Merz posted a message of solidarity with Ukraine, and then, significantly, announced Germany would relax its strict debt break rules specifically to boost defense spending.
A major policy shift in Germany directly linked to this Oval Office clash.
It seemed directly linked, yes. A concrete step towards that independence Merz had talked about. Even the British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, was reportedly blindsided by the news coming out of the Zelensky-Trump meeting, despite having just had seemingly positive talks himself in the U.S.
Shows how quickly things were moving and how compartmentalized information might have been.
Or perhaps how rapidly the mood could shift within the administration.
Starmer, back in the UK, immediately got on the phone to both Trump and Zelensky, trying to do damage control.
Yes, playing the role of mediator, trying to keep lines of communication open.
And when Zelensky arrived in London shortly after, Starmer gave him a very public, very warm welcome, a clear show of support.
A very deliberate gesture. Then Starmer and Macron apparently started working together, trying to form a sort of coalition of the willing to draft their own peace plan proposal to take back to Trump.
Europe trying to take the initiative, fill the vacuum.
Precisely, trying to salvage something from the situation.
Zelensky also met with King Charles while in London, which apparently didn't go down well with Trump, seen as some kind of slight.
That was the suggestion, that the optics of the European love-in for Zelensky right after the Washington clash might have irritated the White House.
And there's this theory, isn't there, that an interview Zelensky gave just before leaving London, where he sounded quite pessimistic and said peace was very, very far away, might have been the final trigger.
Yes, some speculate that downbeat assessment, perhaps combined with the optics of the London visit, could have been the final straw that led Trump to reportedly halt U.S. military aid to Ukraine around that time, a culmination of tensions boiling over.
A really complex, sensitive dynamic where seemingly small things could have huge consequences.
Absolutely. And in the weeks after, European diplomats were reportedly working frantically behind the scenes to try and mend that broken Trump-Zelensky relationship.
But the damage was done. A U.S. brokered ceasefire agreement ultimately fell through later on.
It did. And while eventually the headline shifted, maybe towards Trump's focus on trade tariffs and other issues, the wounds from that intense period in February, they remained. The fundamental trust had been deeply shaken.
So looking back at this incredibly turbulent few weeks, it's just astonishing how rapidly and profoundly that transatlantic relationship shifted.
It really is a genuine hinge point, it seems.
And I think for everyone listening, the key things to take away are, first, the serious questioning of the U.S. as a reliable, long-term partner, something unthinkable for decades.
That's fundamental.
Second, the direct consequence of that, a much stronger push within Europe for self-reliance, particularly in defense, the need to stand on their own feet.
A move towards strategic autonomy accelerated dramatically.
And third, just a stark reminder of how unpredictable, how volatile international diplomacy can be, how quickly assumptions can be overturned.
Definitely. It underscores the fragility of alliances and the constant need for vigilance and adaptation.
So it really leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? Considering these events, this dramatic reshaping in early 2025, what does the future of European security actually look like? And maybe more broadly, what does it mean for the global balance of power?
That's a crucial question going forward. What new roles will individual nations and alliances like NATO or the EU need to play in this clearly evolving and arguably more dangerous landscape? It really forces a fundamental rethink.